When I calmly pressed the manual override button, hidden beneath the altar's floral arrangement, my mother-in-law Evelyn's triumphant smile vanished as the pristine white Vera Wang gown she'd worn to upstage me transformed into a soaked, mascara-streaked disaster, while 200 wedding guests gasped in perfect unison as 6 months of calculated manipulation finally received the justice it deserved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You want to talk about wedding boundaries? Let's discuss what happens when someone thinks they can destroy the most important day of your life. Before we dive into this wild journey of revenge, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story of perfect wedding justice gets your heart racing, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got an even more shocking tale of family drama that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The morning of my wedding to Cameron Mitchell should have been the happiest day of my life. 6 months of meticulous planning had led to this moment at the prestigious Grandview Manor in the heart of Willowbrook Valley, where rolling hills met manicured gardens, and fairy tale dreams were supposed to come true. The venue was everything I had imagined since childhood: stone archways draped in cascading white roses, crystal chandeliers catching the morning light, and a ceremony space that overlooked the valley like something from a romance novel. I should have been floating on cloud 9, surrounded by my closest friends and family, preparing to marry the man I loved more than anything in the world. Instead, I was standing in the bridal suite, staring at security footage on my wedding planner's tablet that confirmed my worst fears about the woman who was about to become my mother-in-law. Evelyn Pierce had arrived at Grandview Manor exactly 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, stepping out of her silver Mercedes wearing a floor-length, off-white silk gown that was so close to my dress color, it might as well have been a carbon copy. The beading, the silhouette, even the train length, everything had been carefully chosen to compete with, if not completely overshadow, my own bridal look. But here's the thing that made my blood boil as I watched that security footage. This wasn't some innocent fashion mistake or unfortunate coincidence. This was the culmination of 6 months of systematic sabotage, emotional manipulation, and deliberate attempts to ruin every aspect of my wedding planning process. Evelyn had been waging psychological warfare against me since the moment Cameron proposed, and wearing white to my wedding was her final, most audacious move in a campaign designed to establish her dominance over both my marriage and my relationship with her son. The woman who had raised Cameron as a single mother after his father died when he was 15 had spent the last 6 months positioning herself as the ultimate authority on everything from venue selection to menu choices, consistently undermining my decisions while presenting herself as the voice of reason and financial responsibility. She had opinions about everything, and I mean everything from my choice of wedding colors, to the guest list, the music selection, and even the style of my engagement ring. Every conversation about wedding planning had become a battlefield where Evelyn's preferences were presented as non-negotiable requirements, while my desires were dismissed as impractical, expensive, or inappropriate for someone marrying into the Pierce family. She had a way of making me feel like an outsider trying to crash a party that was rightfully hers, as if my own wedding was some kind of inconvenient interruption to her relationship with her son. The dress situation was just the latest and most egregious example of her boundary-crossing behavior. 3 weeks earlier, she had cornered me at what was supposed to be our final dress fitting, suggesting that my chosen gown was too attention-seeking for a family wedding, and that I should consider something more modest and appropriate for someone who wasn't from our social circle. The implication was clear: I wasn't good enough for her son, and my wedding dress was somehow evidence of my inadequacy. When I had politely but firmly declined her suggestion to exchange my dress for something she deemed more suitable, Evelyn had smiled with the kind of cold calculation that should have prepared me for what was coming. "Of course, dear," she had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It's your day, after all. I'm sure you'll make the choices that feel right to you." What I didn't realize at the time was that she was already planning her own dress selection, a gown that would ensure all eyes would be on her rather than me during the most important moments of my wedding ceremony. She had spent weeks researching wedding etiquette violations that would create maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability, and wearing white was her masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. The security footage showed her arriving with a small entourage of Cameron's relatives, who had been equally complicit in her campaign to establish dominance over our wedding celebration. His aunt Priscilla, cousin Delphine, and grandmother Beatrice had all been coached to support Evelyn's narrative that my wedding planning choices were evidence of poor judgment and financial irresponsibility. But as I stood there in my bridal suite, watching this woman attempt to sabotage the most important day of my life, something shifted inside me. 6 months of accepting her manipulation, making compromises to keep the peace, and prioritizing family harmony over my own happiness had reached its breaking point. The careful, respectful approach I had been taking clearly wasn't working, and Evelyn's escalating behavior suggested that she would continue pushing boundaries until someone finally pushed back. That's when I remembered the conversation I'd had with the venue's head groundskeeper, Martinez Rodriguez, during our final walkthrough 3 days earlier. He had mentioned the manual override system for the garden sprinkler network, a feature that could be activated in case of fire emergencies or other situations, requiring immediate water access throughout the ceremony space. The system was designed to be virtually invisible during normal operations, with sprinkler heads concealed among the landscaping and floral arrangement. But with the right activation sequence, the entire garden area could be transformed into a water feature within seconds, creating what would appear to be a catastrophic malfunction rather than a deliberate action. As I watched Evelyn smugly adjusting her white dress in the security footage, positioning herself for maximum visual impact during my processional, I realized that sometimes the only way to stop a manipulative person is to give them exactly what they deserve: consequences that match the audacity of their behavior. The morning that was supposed to mark the beginning of my happily ever after was about to become the day that Evelyn Pierce learned that some boundaries should never be crossed, and that underestimating the bride on her wedding day was a mistake she would never forget. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started, because trust me, the journey to that perfect moment of justice is worth every single detail. First though, I'm absolutely loving all the comments pouring in from around the world. I see viewers from Texas saying, "She had it coming," someone from Manchester calling this brilliant revenge, and Sarah from Toronto asking if this really happened. Yes girl, every single word is true, and I have the wedding photos to prove. Keep those comments coming, because your support means everything to me. And if you're enjoying this wild ride of wedding drama, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because tomorrow's story involves a bridesmaid who tried to steal the groom, and let's just say her scheme backfired spectacularly. Now, where was I? Oh yes, how this all began. 18 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be planning elaborate revenge against my future mother-in-law, I would have laughed and called them crazy. Back then, I was Natasha Bryan Reynolds, a 28-year-old marketing coordinator for Stellar Communications in downtown Crescent City, living my perfectly ordinary life in a cozy apartment in the Riverside district, completely blissfully unaware that my world was about to be turned upside down by love, manipulation, and the most dramatic wedding day in Willowbrook Valley history. My life was beautifully predictable in all the best ways. Monday through Friday, I'd grab my usual vanilla latte from Carmen's Coffee Corner on Magnolia Street, take the 12-minute walk to my office in the Meridian Tower, and spend my days creating marketing campaigns for small businesses throughout the Tri-County area. Weekends were for hiking the Silverstone Trail with my best friend Zoe, trying new restaurants in the Arts Quarter, or curling up with a good book and my cat, Professor Whiskers. Yes, that's really his name, and yes, he's as dignified as he sounds. I had goals, dreams, and a 5-year plan that included saving for a house, maybe getting promoted to senior marketing coordinator, and eventually finding someone special to share adventures with. Life was good, stable, and completely drama-free. I had no idea that drama was about to find me in the most unexpected way possible. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday evening in March when I quite literally bumped into Cameron Mitchell at Riverside Market, while reaching for the last box of my favorite herbal tea. Picture this. I'm standing there in my yoga pants and oversized sweater, hair in a messy bun, no makeup, looking like I'd just rolled out of bed. Which, let's be honest, I basically had after a long day at work, when this dark-haired man, with the most incredible smile, apologizes for nearly knocking the tea out of my hands. Cameron was everything I hadn't known I was looking for. At 31, he was a senior project manager for Pinnacle Construction, the kind of guy who could fix anything, build anything, and somehow make discussing home renovation projects sound like poetry. He had this way of listening when you talked that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, and his laugh, God, his laugh could make even the worst day feel manageable. That chance encounter led to coffee the next day, dinner the following weekend, and within 3 months we were practically inseparable. Cameron was thoughtful in ways that surprised me daily, bringing me my favorite chocolate croissants when I was stressed about a big presentation, remembering that I had a dentist appointment, and texting to ask how it went, showing up with soup and terrible romantic comedies when I caught a cold. He talked about his mother frequently during those early months, always with deep affection and respect that made my heart melt. Ellen had raised him alone after his father David Pierce died in a construction accident when Cameron was just 50. She'd worked double shifts as a hospital administrator to put him through college, sacrificed her own social life to support his dreams, and had been his primary emotional support system through every major life decision. "She's going to love you," Cameron would say, his eyes lighting up whenever he mentioned introducing us. "Mom has such good instincts about people, and I can't wait for her to see what an amazing woman you are." The way he talked about Evelyn made her sound like the kind of mother-in-law dreams were made of, supportive, welcoming, excited to gain a daughter rather than losing a son. He painted pictures of family dinners, holiday traditions, and the kind of close-knit family bonds that I'd always envied since my own parents lived across the country in Oregon, and we only managed to see each other twice a year. For 6 blissful months, Cameron and I built our relationship in a bubble of just the two of us happiness. We explored every hiking trail within a 50-mile radius, tried every restaurant in Crescent City's historic downtown, and spent countless evenings, planning imaginary futures while cooking dinner in his apartment, overlooking Harbor Park. Those were the golden months when love felt simple and uncomplicated, when our biggest decisions were whether to order pizza or cook pasta, whether to watch an action movie or a comedy, whether to spend Sunday morning at the farmer's market or sleeping in until noon. I had no idea that this peaceful, drama-free period was about to end the moment Cameron decided it was time for me to meet his mother. Looking back now, I can see that those 6 months were like the calm before the storm, a beautiful, deceptive period of normalcy that made what came next feel even more shocking and destabilizing. If I had known then what I know now about Evelyn Pierce and her talent for psychological manipulation, I might have approached that first meeting with a completely different strategy. But hindsight is 20/20, and at the time all I felt was excitement and nervous anticipation about meeting the woman who had raised the man I was falling deeply in love with. I actually spent hours planning the perfect outfit, researching topics we might have in common, and mentally rehearsing responses to questions I imagined she might ask about my background, my career, and my intentions regarding her son. Oh, how naive I was. The first meeting was scheduled for a Sunday brunch at Willowbrook Valley Country Club, Evelyn's preferred venue for important social occasions. Cameron had described it as casual and relaxed, just the three of us getting to know each other over mimosas and eggs Benedict in a beautiful setting that his mother loved. What he failed to mention was that this wouldn't just be a simple introduction, it would be the opening move in a complex chess game where I didn't even know I was playing, let alone understand the rules. The Sunday brunch at Willowbrook Valley Country Club should have been my first red flag, but love has a way of making you see what you want to see instead of what's actually happening right in front of your face. Cameron picked me up at 11 sharp, looking handsome in his navy blazer and khakis, practically bouncing with excitement about finally introducing the two most important women in his life. During the 20-minute drive through the winding roads of Willowbrook Valley, he kept reassuring me that his mother was going to adore me, that she'd been asking about me constantly, and that this brunch was going to be the beginning of a beautiful relationship between his girls. "She's been so patient, waiting for me to find the right person," Cameron said as we pulled into the country club's circular driveway, lined with perfectly manicured topiaries and imported stone fountains. Mom always said she'd know when I met the one because I'd light up differently when I talked about her. She says that's exactly what happens when I mention you. The Willowbrook Valley Country Club was exactly the kind of place that screamed old money and established social hierarchy. Founded in 1924, it sprawled across 200 acres of rolling hills, featuring championship golf courses, tennis courts, equestrian facilities, and a main clubhouse that looked like it had been transplanted directly from an English manor. The dining room where we were meeting Evelyn overlooked the 18th hole, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased perfectly maintained greens and distant mountain views. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a soft pink sweater dress that was elegant but not too formal, paired with nude flats and minimal jewelry. I wanted to strike the perfect balance between making a good impression and not appearing to try too hard. Looking back, I realize I was already unconsciously trying to manage someone else's expectations before I'd even met them, which should have been warning sign number 1. Evelyn Pierce was waiting for us at a prime table by the windows, and my first impression was that she looked exactly like what I'd imagined Cameron's mother would look like. At 54, she was impeccably put together in a way that suggested both natural elegance and significant time invested in maintenance. Her ash blonde hair was styled in a perfect bob that probably required weekly salon visits. Her makeup was flawless but understated, and her cream-colored designer suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. But it was her smile that I remember most clearly from that first meeting. Perfectly white teeth, warm and welcoming on the surface, but something about her eyes that didn't quite match the enthusiasm of her expression. It was like looking at a beautiful painting where one tiny detail is just slightly off, creating an unsettling feeling that you can't quite identify. "Natasha, finally," Evelyn exclaimed, rising from her chair with arms extended for what appeared to be a genuine enthusiastic hug. "Cameron has told me so much about you, and I've been absolutely dying to meet the woman who's captured my son's heart so completely." Her embrace was perfectly executed, warm enough to seem maternal, brief enough to maintain appropriate boundaries, and accompanied by the kind of subtle perfume that probably cost $300 an hour. Everything about the interaction felt choreographed for maximum positive impact, which again should have raised alarms, but I was too nervous and eager to please to notice the performance quality of her warmth. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you, Miss Pierce," I replied, accepting her hug and trying to match her enthusiasm without appearing overeager. "Cameron talks about you constantly, and I've been looking forward to this for weeks." "Please, call me Evelyn," she insisted, her hand briefly touching my arm in what seemed like a gesture of immediate intimacy. "We're practically family already, aren't we? No need for formality between us." The brunch itself was a masterclass in subtle interrogation disguised as friendly conversation. Evelyn had clearly done her homework about me, asking questions that demonstrated she already knew far more about my background, career, and personal history than Cameron could have possibly shared in casual conversation. She knew about my college major, my previous jobs, my parents' occupations, even details about my apartment lease and monthly expenses that I was certain I'd never mentioned to Cameron. "So you're renting that lovely little place in the Riverside district," she said, delicately cutting her eggs, Benedict with surgical precision. "Such a charming neighborhood, though I imagine the rent must be quite significant for someone on a marketing coordinator salary. How do you manage to save anything for the future?" The question was phrased as motherly concern, but it felt like a financial audit. I found myself explaining my budgeting strategies, my student loan payments, and my modest savings account to a woman I'd known for exactly 30 minutes. Cameron seemed oblivious to the invasive nature of her questions, beaming proudly as I detailed my responsible financial planning. "Mom's always been practical about money," he explained later, as if reading my expression. "She had to be, raising me alone. She just wants to make sure you're financially stable because she cares about our future together." Throughout the 2-hour brunch, Evelyn demonstrated an uncanny ability to ask personal questions that felt inappropriate while making them sound like natural expressions of maternal interest. She wanted to know about my family's financial situation, my career ambitions, my thoughts on children and homemaking, my religious beliefs, and my opinions on everything from political issues to lifestyle choices. Each topic was introduced with a warm smile and framed as getting to know you conversation, but the underlying message was clear. She was conducting a comprehensive evaluation of my suitability for her son, and based on her subtle reactions to my answers, I was apparently failing several important criteria. When I mentioned that my parents were middle-class teachers who had worked multiple jobs to put me through college, Evelyn's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. When I talked about my career goals and ambitions for advancement in marketing, she nodded politely but made comments about the importance of family priority. When Cameron mentioned that we'd been talking about moving in together, her pause was just long enough to suggest disapproval before she recovered with enthusiastic support for young people taking their time to really get to know each other. The most telling moment came when Cameron excused himself to take a work call, leaving Evelyn and me alone for 10 minutes. The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, not hostile but definitely cooler, more assessing, like a scientist studying a specimen under a microscope. "Cameron is such a special young man," she said, her voice carrying a tone that was both proud and possessive. "After everything we've been through together, losing his father so young, building our life from nothing, he deserves someone who truly understands the kind of partner he needs." The emphasis on "truly understands" felt like a challenge, as if she was suggesting that I might not be capable of providing what her son required. When I assured her that I cared deeply about Cameron and wanted nothing but his happiness, she smiled and patted my hand in a gesture that somehow managed to feel both affectionate and condescending. "Of course you do, dear. That's lovely to hear." The drive home was filled with Cameron's excited chatter about how well the meeting had gone, how much his mother had enjoyed getting to know me, and how thrilled he was that his two favorite women were already bonded. I found myself nodding and agreeing while privately wondering if we'd attended the same brunch. "She really likes you," Cameron said confidently as we pulled into my apartment complex. "I can tell. Mom has a way of asking lots of questions when she's interested in someone. It's her way of showing she cares." Over the following weeks I tried to convince myself that Cameron was right, that Evelyn's intense questioning had been a sign of genuine interest rather than suspicion. I wanted so badly for his assessment to be accurate because I was falling more deeply in love with him every day, and his relationship with his mother was clearly central to his identity and happiness. But the seeds of doubt had been planted during that first brunch, and they began growing stronger with each subsequent interaction with Evelyn Pierce. What I didn't realize at the time was that the country club meeting had been a carefully orchestrated evaluation, and I had apparently been found wanting in several crucial areas. Evelyn had been assessing my background, my financial status, my family connections, and my potential for challenging her position as the primary woman in her son's life. The brunch wasn't the beginning of our relationship, it was the opening move in a war I didn't even know was being declared. The first real crack in the facade appeared 3 weeks after our country club brunch, when Cameron surprised me with the news that his mother had volunteered to help us plan what she called a proper engagement celebration, despite the fact that we weren't actually engaged yet. I was at Cameron's apartment, curled up on his couch, grading some marketing proposals for work, when he burst through the door with the kind of excitement usually reserved for lottery winners or surprise vacation announcements. Professor Whiskers, who had been napping on my lap, shot me an accusatory look as Cameron's enthusiasm disrupted our peaceful evening routine. "Babe, you're going to love this," Cameron announced, practically vibrating with energy as he dropped his construction helmet and work boots by the door. "Mom called me today with the most incredible offer. She wants to throw us an engagement party at the country club next month." I looked up from my laptop, confused. "An engagement party? Cameron, we're not engaged." His grin widened as he pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, and suddenly my world tilted on its axis. "Well, that's about to change right now." The proposal itself was everything I could have dreamed of, heartfelt, romantic, and completely unexpected in the best possible way. Cameron dropped to one knee right there in his living room, with takeout containers still scattered on the coffee table, and Professor Whiskers serving as our only witness, telling me that he'd been carrying the ring around for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. "Natasha Bryan Reynolds," he said, his voice shaking slightly with nerves and excitement, "you've made me happier than I ever thought possible. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you laugh?"
bringing you terrible coffee in bed, and pretending to like your cat's attitude. Through my tears of joy and laughter, I managed to say yes, and for about 10 minutes, everything in the world felt absolutely perfect. We called my parents in Oregon, who screamed with excitement loud enough that the neighbors probably heard them 3 states away. We opened a bottle of champagne that Cameron had apparently been hiding in his refrigerator for weeks. We spent an hour planning our future and talking about everything from honeymoon destinations to whether we wanted kids right away or wanted to travel first. Then, Cameron mentioned calling his mother to share the news, and reality came crashing back. Actually, he said, looking slightly sheepish, Mom already knows about the proposal. She helped me pick out the ring, and when I told her I was planning to propose soon, she got so excited about planning an engagement party that I didn't have the heart to tell her to wait. The first warning bells started ringing in my head. She helped you pick out the ring? Well, yeah, Mom has great taste, and she knows about jewelry. Plus, she insisted on contributing to the cost, since she said this was such an important family milestone. Cameron was examining the ring on my finger with obvious pride, completely missing the alarm that was spreading across my face. She said it was important that your ring reflect the Pierce family standards and represent our commitment to building something lasting together.
The ring was beautiful. A classic solitaire with a substantial diamond that was definitely more expensive than anything Cameron could have afforded on his project manager salary. But knowing that Evelyn had not only selected it, but also partially paid for it, made me feel like I was wearing a symbol of her approval rather than Cameron's love. "And she's already planning an engagement party?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the growing knot in my stomach. "She's so excited, Natasha. She's been talking about this for weeks, making lists of guest lists and menu options, researching musicians and photographers. She said she wants to introduce you properly to the Pierce family social circle and make sure everyone knows how welcomed you are into our family." Cameron's enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in his vision of family celebration, despite my reservations about Evelyn's involvement. After all, this was supposed to be one of the happiest times of our lives, and having supportive family members who wanted to celebrate with us should have been a blessing, not a source of anxiety. The next morning, Evelyn called me directly for the first time since we'd met, ostensibly to congratulate me on the engagement and discuss party planning details. Her timing was impeccable. She reached me during my lunch break at work, when I was alone in the office break room and couldn't easily cut the conversation short without seeming rude. "Natasha, darling, I'm absolutely thrilled about the engagement." Evelyn's voice carried the perfect combination of maternal warmth and social excitement. "Cameron is over the moon, and I couldn't be happier to officially welcome you into our family. I hope you love the ring." Cameron and I spent hours selecting something that would properly represent the significance of this commitment. The emphasis on properly represent felt loaded with meaning that I couldn't quite decipher, but I thanked her for her involvement and expressed appreciation for her contribution to the ring purchase. What choice did I have? The ring was already on my finger, the proposal was already accepted, and criticizing her involvement would have made me sound ungrateful and petty. "Now about this engagement party," Evelyn continued, her tone shifting into what I would later recognize as her planning and organizing mode. "I've taken the liberty of booking the Rose Garden Room at the Country Club for Saturday, October 15th. It's their most elegant space and I wanted to make sure we secured it before someone else grabbed the date." I nearly choked on my sandwich. "You already booked a venue," without discussing the date or asking if we had any preferences. "Oh, darling. I hope you don't mind my taking initiative. I know how busy you young people are with work and daily responsibilities, and event planning can be so overwhelming when you're not familiar with the process. I've been organizing social events for the Pierce family for decades, so I thought I'd handle the logistics while you focus on more important things like choosing your dress and preparing for married life." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Evelyn informed me about decisions she'd already made regarding guest lists, catering options, musical entertainment, and decorative theme. Every choice reflected her personal preferences and social connections, rather than anything Cameron and I might have wanted for our own celebration. The guest list included over 100 people, most of whom I'd never met, Evelyn's friends from the country club, Cameron's extended family from across the region, colleagues from her hospital administrator days, and various social acquaintances she felt should be included in what she called such an important Pierce family milestone. I've also taken the liberty of contacting Adrienne Blackwell Photography. She's the most sought-after event photographer in the valley, and I managed to secure her services for the evening. Her portfolio is absolutely stunning, and she has such an eye for capturing the elegant details that make these occasions memorable. When I mentioned that we might have preferred to choose our own photographer, or at least be involved in the selection process, Evelyn's response was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as maternal guidance. Of course, dear, if you have someone specific in mind, we can certainly discuss alternatives. I just wanted to ensure we had professional coverage secured, since quality photographers book months in advance and I know you probably haven't had time to research options yet. Adrienne is very expensive, but Cameron's engagement deserves the best, don't you think? By the end of the phone call, I felt like I'd been steamrolled by a very polite, very well-intentioned bulldozer. Every attempt I made to express preferences or suggest alternatives was met with explanations about why Evelyn's choices were superior, more practical, or more appropriate for the kind of celebration that would properly honor Cameron and introduce me to their social circle. The most troubling part wasn't even the specific decisions she'd made, it was the underlying assumption that these were her decisions to make at all. She was operating from a position of authority that nobody had granted her, making choices about our engagement celebration as if she were the mother of the bride rather than the groom, and framing her control as generous assistance that we should be grateful to receive. That evening, when I tried to discuss my concerns with Cameron, he brushed off my worries with the same explanation he'd been using since our first meeting with his mother. She was just excited. She wanted to help, she had experience with these kinds of events, and her involvement was a sign of how much she cared about our happiness. She's not trying to take over, Cameron insisted as we cleaned up dinner dishes in his kitchen. She's just trying to make sure everything is perfect because this is important to her too. Mom's been dreaming about my wedding since I was little, and now that it's actually happening, she wants to contribute to making it special. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the engagement ring that sparkled in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn wasn't trying to contribute to our celebration, she was trying to control it, and this engagement party was just the beginning. Parameter. Invoke. The engagement party at Willowbrook Valley Country Club should have been a celebration of Cameron's and my future together. Instead, it became a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and the first time I truly understood that I wasn't gaining a mother-in-law, I was acquiring an adversary who was far more sophisticated than I had ever imagined. The evening started normally enough. I had spent weeks agonizing over the perfect dress, finally settling on a midnight blue cocktail dress that was elegant but not too attention-grabbing, since Evelyn had made several comments about the importance of appropriate attire for family occasions. Cameron looked handsome in his charcoal suit, and as we drove to the country club, he was practically glowing with excitement about introducing me to his extended family and celebrating our engagement in style. "You're going to love meeting everyone," he said as we walked through the club's imposing entrance hall, past oil paintings of founding members and crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's car. "Aunt Priscilla has been dying to meet you ever since Mom told her about the engagement, and Cousin Delphine drove down from Portland specifically for tonight. They're going to adore you." The Rose Garden room was transformed into something that belonged in a magazine spread about high society events. Evelyn had outdone herself with the decorations, cascading white roses and eucalyptus garlands, ambient lighting that made everything glow softly, round tables draped in ivory linens, with gold accents, and a string quartet playing classical music in the corner. It was undeniably beautiful, and it was also completely not what I would have chosen for our engagement celebration. The first red flag appeared within minutes of our arrival, when I realized that none of my friends or family members were anywhere to be seen. I had provided Evelyn with a list of 20 people I wanted to invite: my college roommates, work colleagues, a few close friends from Crescent City, and some family friends who had known me since childhood. According to Evelyn, she had sent invitations to everyone on my list. "I'm sure they'll be here soon," Cameron said when I mentioned that none of my people had arrived yet. Traffic from the city can be unpredictable on Saturday evening. But as the cocktail hour stretched on and more of Cameron's relatives and Evelyn's social circle arrived, it became clear that my guests weren't just running late. They weren't coming at all. When I discreetly called my best friend Zoe to check on her whereabouts, she dropped a bombshell that made my stomach sink to my toes. "Natasha, I never received an invitation," Zoe said, her voice confused and slightly hurt. "I've been waiting to hear about party details for weeks. Are you sure your future mother-in-law sent one to my address?" A quick series of text messages to other friends on my list confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. None of them had received invitation. Somehow, in all of Evelyn's meticulous party planning, she had forgotten to actually invite the people who mattered most to me, while ensuring that every single person from her social circle was present and accounted for. When I confronted Evelyn about the missing invitations during a quiet moment by the bar, her response was a perfect example of gaslighting disguised as innocent mistake. "Oh my goodness, darling, how terrible. There must have been some kind of mix-up with the invitations," she said, her face a picture of concerned dismay. "I specifically remember addressing envelopes for all the names on your list. Perhaps there was an issue with the postal service, or maybe some of the addresses weren't current. These things happen sometimes with large mailings." Her explanation sounded plausible enough that I might have believed it, if not for the fact that she immediately followed up with suggestions about why my friend's absence was actually a blessing in disguise. "In some ways this might work out better for you," Evelyn continued, her hand touching my arm in that gesture of false intimacy I was beginning to recognize. "This gives you a wonderful opportunity to focus on meeting Cameron's family without the distraction of managing multiple friend groups. First impressions are so important, and you'll be able to give your full attention to the people who will be part of your life for decades to come." The evening continued with a series of increasingly uncomfortable interactions that followed the same pattern. Evelyn positioning herself as my guide and interpreter for social situations, while simultaneously undermining my confidence and independence. She introduced me to Cameron's relatives with descriptions that managed to sound complimentary while highlighting my outsider status. "This is Natasha, Cameron's fiancée," she would say to each new group of relatives. "She's from such a different background than what we're used to in our family. Her parents are public school teachers, and she works in marketing for small businesses. It's wonderful how love can bridge different worlds, isn't it?" The emphasis on different background and different worlds was subtle but unmistakable, and I watched as Cameron's relatives politely smiled while clearly filing away information about my inferior social status. Each introduction felt like a gentle but firm reminder that I didn't naturally belong in their elevated social circle. Aunt Priscilla, a 60-something woman, who looked like she'd stepped out of a country club catalog, was particularly skilled at the art of backhanded compliment. "What a lovely dress, dear. So practical and understated. Exactly the right choice for someone who isn't used to formal events." Cousin Delphine focused on my career, asking pointed questions about my salary and advancement prospects, while expressing concern about whether I'd be able to maintain their family's lifestyle standards. The most disturbing moment came during the formal toasts, when Evelyn stood up to address the gathering with what she called a few words about this joyous occasion. Her speech was a masterpiece of public manipulation, presented as maternal love while establishing clear hierarchies and expectations for our future marriage. "Today we celebrate not just Cameron and Natasha's engagement, but the continuation of the Pierce family legacy," Evelyn began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention at social gatherings. "Cameron has always been such a thoughtful young man, so careful about the important decisions in his life, and I'm thrilled that he's chosen a partner who understands the value of family guidance and traditional value." The speech continued with pointed references to the importance of established families, helping young couples navigate the complexities of marriage, the value of experienced guidance during the early years of building a life together, and the significance of maintaining family traditions while welcoming new members who are eager to learn and adapt. Every phrase was carefully crafted to sound supportive while establishing Evelyn's ongoing authority over our relationship decisions. She was publicly announcing her expectation that she would continue to be involved in major aspects of our married life, while positioning my role as that of a grateful student who needed her wisdom and guidance
to successfully integrate into their family. Cameron beamed throughout the entire speech, completely missing the undertones that were making me increasingly uncomfortable. When Evelyn finished by proposing a toast to Cameron and Natasha, and to the bright future they'll build with the love and support of family who will always be here to help guide their way, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "Isn't she amazing? I love how much she cares about us." The evening concluded with what Evelyn called a special surprise, a slideshow presentation featuring photos of Cameron growing up, set to music she had selected, with commentary about his achievements and the close bond they share. It was essentially a multimedia love letter to their mother-son relationship, presented at our engagement party, with me sitting there as a largely irrelevant audience member watching a celebration of their connection. The final photo in the slideshow was particularly telling, Cameron and Evelyn at his college graduation, with her arm around his shoulders and both of them looking directly at the camera with identical smiles. The caption read, "Mother and son together through every milestone, ready for whatever the future brings." The message was unmistakable. Their relationship was permanent and primary, while mine with Cameron was new and conditional. I was being welcomed into their dynamic, not creating a new family unit with him. During the drive home, Cameron was euphoric about the party's success, the positive reactions from his family, and the beautiful way his mother had honored our engagement. He interpreted every moment that had made me uncomfortable as evidence of how much his family cared about our happiness. "Did you see how excited Aunt Priscilla was to meet you? And Cousin Delphine was so impressed with your career. She kept asking questions because she was genuinely interested in your work." Cameron's ability to reframe condescending interrogation as enthusiastic interest was becoming a pattern that worried me. Mom outdid herself tonight. That speech was perfect, and the slideshow was such a thoughtful touch. She really wanted everyone to understand how important this engagement is to our whole family. As I lay in bed that night, still wearing the engagement ring that felt heavier with each passing day, I tried to process what had happened. The party had been beautiful, expensive, and meticulously planned. Cameron's family had been polite, welcoming in their way, and genuinely happy about his engagement. On the surface, everything had been perfect, but underneath the surface, I had experienced something more subtle and disturbing, a systematic process of isolation, positioning, and hierarchy establishment that left me feeling like a visitor in my own engagement celebration. Evelyn had orchestrated an evening that appeared to honor our relationship while actually demonstrating her control over it. The missing invitations to my friends weren't a postal error, they were a deliberate choice to ensure that I would be surrounded entirely by her people, dependent on her introductions, and vulnerable to her framing of who I was and where I fit in their family structure. This wasn't just about wedding planning or family involvement. This was about power, control, and establishing the terms under which I would be allowed to love her son. The breaking point came exactly 3 weeks after our engagement party, during what should have been a routine appointment with our wedding coordinator at Grandview Manor. I had been looking forward to this meeting for days. Finally, a chance to make decisions about our actual wedding with a neutral professional who would focus on our preferences rather than Evelyn's vision of what a Pierce family wedding should look like. Cameron and I arrived at Grandview Manor early on a crisp Tuesday morning in November, both of us excited to begin the real planning process. The venue was even more breathtaking in the autumn light, with the maple trees surrounding the property ablaze in shades of gold and crimson, and the manor's stone facade looking like something from a fairy tale romance novel. Isabella Hawthorne, our assigned wedding coordinator, met us in the elegant consultation room with coffee, pastries, and thick portfolio books, filled with inspiration photos and vendor information. Isabella was exactly what I had hoped for: professional, experienced, and genuinely enthusiastic about helping us create the wedding of our dreams, rather than imposing her own ideas about what our celebration should look like. "I'm so excited to work with you both," Isabella said as we settled into comfortable chairs around a mahogany conference table covered with sample invitations, fabric swatches, and venue photographs. "I've been looking forward to this initial consultation since you booked with us. Tell me about your vision for the wedding. What's most important to you as a couple, what kind of atmosphere you want to create, and what elements you absolutely can't live without." For the first time in months, I felt like someone was actually asking what Cameron and I wanted for our own wedding day. We spent an hour discussing everything from ceremony location preferences to reception music styles, menu options to floral arrangements, photography styles to guest experience priority. Isabella took detailed notes, asked thoughtful questions, and helped us articulate ideas we hadn't even realized we had about our perfect wedding. Cameron wanted an outdoor ceremony overlooking the valley, with the reception in Grandview Manor's grand ballroom. I dreamed of garden party elegance with lots of natural light, seasonal flowers, and an atmosphere that felt romantic but relaxed. We both agreed that we wanted live music for dancing, a menu that reflected our shared love of good food and wine, and photography that captured genuine moments rather than stiff formal poses. "This sounds absolutely magical," Isabella said, making notes about our preferences and beginning to sketch out timeline possibilities. "I can already envision how beautiful this is going to be." Now, I do need to mention that I received a call yesterday from someone who identified herself as the mother of the groom, asking about scheduling a separate consultation to discuss wedding planning details. Cameron and I exchanged glances. "A separate consultation?" I asked, a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "Yes, a Mrs. Evelyn Pierce." She was quite insistent that she needed to meet with me privately to discuss what she called family expectations and budget parameters for the wedding planning process. She mentioned that she'd be contributing significantly to the wedding costs, and wanted to ensure that all decisions aligned with Pierce family traditions. The room felt like it had suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Cameron looked confused, while I felt the blood draining from my face as I realized what was happening. Evelyn was attempting to insert herself directly into our wedding planning process, positioning herself as a decision-maker rather than a supportive family member. I told her that our policy is to work directly with the engaged couple, unless they specifically request family involvement in planning meetings. Isabella continued, clearly noting our reaction, but she was quite persistent, mentioning that she had extensive experience with social events and felt responsible for ensuring that the wedding reflected appropriate standards for a family of their standing in the community. Cameron's expression shifted from confusion to embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Isabella. My mother gets very enthusiastic about family events, but she shouldn't have contacted you without discussing it with us first. The wedding planning decisions are obviously ours to make." But as Cameron spoke, I could see the wheels turning in his head, and I knew what was coming next. His automatic response to any situation involving his mother was to find ways to accommodate her involvement while minimizing conflict, even when her behavior was clearly inappropriate. Although, he added, glancing at me apologetically, "Mom does have a lot of experience with event planning, and she's offering to help with costs. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to include her in some of the planning discussions. She just wants to be helped." The familiar pattern was reasserting itself. Evelyn overstepping boundaries, Cameron making excuses for her behavior, and me being positioned as the unreasonable one if I objected to her involvement. But this time something was different. This time I had a neutral professional witness to Evelyn's attempted manipulation. "Actually," Isabella said carefully, "there's something else I should mention. Pierce didn't just ask for a consultation, she also provided me with quite detailed instructions about vendor preferences, budget allocations, and what she called non-negotiable elements for the wedding celebration." My heart started racing. "What kind of instruction?" Isabella opened a folder and pulled out several pages of handwritten notes. She specified that the ceremony should be held in the manor's chapel rather than outdoors, that the reception should feature a formal seated dinner rather than a cocktail-style celebration, and that all vendors should be selected from what she called established local businesses with appropriate reputations. The notes continued with detailed requirements about everything from the color palette, ivory and gold, classic and sophisticated rather than seasonal or colorful options, to the musical entertainment, classical string quartet for ceremony, big band orchestra for reception dancing, to the photography style, traditional formal portraits, rather than candid photojournalism. She also provided a preliminary guest list of over 300 people, Isabella added, and mentioned that invitations should be ordered through Pemberton Stationery, because they've handled Pierce family correspondence for over 20 years. Every single detail Evelyn had specified contradicted the preferences Cameron and I had just spent an hour discussing with Isabella. She had essentially planned a completely different wedding, her wedding, not ours, and expected the professional we had hired to implement her vision regardless of what we actually wanted. "This is unbelievable," I said, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. She contacted our wedding coordinator behind our backs and tried to override every decision we've made about our own wedding. Cameron looked mortified, but his response revealed the depth of his psychological conditioning when it came to his mother's behavior. I'm sure she didn't mean it that way, Natasha. She probably just wanted to be helpful by doing some preliminary research. You know how she gets excited about family events, Cameron, I said, turning to face him directly. She tried to plan our entire wedding without consulting us. She contacted our vendor and attempted to give instructions about our celebration as if she were the bride instead of me. This isn't excitement, this is taking over. Isabella cleared her throat diplomatically. I want to assure you both that our policy is very clear about these situations. We work exclusively with the engaged couple unless they provide written authorization for family members to make decisions on their behalf. No changes will be made to your wedding plans without your direct approval. But, she continued, I do need to ask how you'd like me to handle future communications from Mrs. Pierce. She mentioned that she would be calling regularly to check on planning progress and provide additional input about vendor selection.
The moment of decision had arrived. I could continue trying to manage Evelyn's boundary violations through diplomacy and compromise, accepting her involvement in exchange for family peace, or I could finally establish clear limits about what level of interference I was willing to tolerate in my own wedding planning. Isabella, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, please add a note to our file that all wedding planning communications should go through Cameron and me exclusively. No information should be shared with family members, and no input from other parties should be accepted without our written approval. Cameron started to object. Natasha, don't you think that's a little harsh? She's just trying to help and she does have good ideas about these things. Cameron, I said, looking directly into his eyes, your mother contacted our wedding coordinator without our knowledge and tried to plan our entire wedding according to her preferences instead of ours. She attempted to override every single decision we made during this meeting today. This isn't helping. This is hijacking. The ride home from Grandview Manor was tense and quiet, with Cameron clearly struggling between his loyalty to his mother and his recognition that her behavior had crossed important lines. I could see him trying to find ways to minimize the significance of what had happened while avoiding a direct confrontation with either of us. But for me, there was no ambiguity anymore. Evelyn's call to Isabella had exposed the true scope of her intentions regarding our wedding planning. She wasn't interested in being a supportive family member who contributed ideas and assistance. She wanted to be the decision-maker who controlled every aspect of our celebration while allowing us to believe we were planning our own wedding. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start documenting every single instance of Evelyn's manipulation and boundary violations. If she wanted to play games with our wedding planning, I was going to be prepared with evidence of exactly what she was doing. I had no idea that this decision would lead me down a path of discovery that would reveal a pattern of control and manipulation far more extensive than I had ever imagined possible. I started my investigation the very next morning with the methodical precision that had made me successful in my marketing career. If Evelyn wanted to play psychological games with our wedding planning, I was going to approach this like any other professional project, with documentation, research and strategic analysis that would give me a clear picture of exactly what I was dealing with. My first stop was Isabella Hawthorne's office at Grandview Manor, where I requested copies of all communications she had received from Evelyn. Isabella was initially hesitant to share confidential information, but when I explained that I needed to understand the full scope of my future mother-in-law's attempted interference, she agreed to provide me with documentation that directly related to our wedding plan. What Isabella showed me was far more disturbing than I had anticipated. Evelyn hadn't just made one phone call with suggestions. She had been conducting a systematic campaign to establish herself as the primary decision-maker for our wedding celebration. The folder Isabella handed me contained printed emails, phone call notes, and detailed written instructions that painted a picture of calculated manipulation that took my breath away. The first email was dated just 3 days after Cameron and I had signed our contract with Grandview Manor, before we had even scheduled our initial consultation. Evelyn had somehow obtained Isabella's contact information and immediately established herself as a key stakeholder in our wedding planning process. Dear Hawthorne, the email began, I am writing as the mother of the groom regarding the upcoming wedding celebration for my son Cameron Pierce and his fiancée. As the primary financial contributor to this event and someone with extensive experience in social event planning, I wanted to establish clear communication regarding family expectations and appropriate standards for this important Pierce family milestone. The email continued with detailed specifications about vendor requirements, budget allocations, and what Evelyn called non-negotiable elements that reflect our family's standing in the community. She had essentially written a comprehensive wedding plan without consulting Cameron or me about any of our actual preferences. But it was the tone of the correspondence that revealed the true scope of her presumption. Evelyn was writing as if she were the bride's mother planning her daughter's wedding, not the groom's mother offering supportive input. She used phrases like, "I have decided," "I require," and "I expect" throughout her instructions, positioning herself as the ultimate authority figure for our celebration. The phone call notes were even more revealing. Isabella had documented multiple conversations where Evelyn attempted to override specific decisions that Cameron and I had made during our consultation. When Isabella mentioned that we had requested an outdoor ceremony, Evelyn insisted that the chapel would be much more appropriate for a family of our stand. When Isabella described our preference for a cocktail-style reception, Evelyn demanded a proper seated dinner that reflects the significance of this union. Most disturbing was Evelyn's attempt to exclude me from the planning process entirely. According to Isabella's notes, Evelyn had suggested that the bride seems overwhelmed by the complexity of planning an event of this magnitude, and proposed that all future communications should go directly through her to ensure that decisions are made efficiently and appropriately. "She actually tried to cut you out of planning your own wedding?" I asked Isabella, struggling to process the audacity of what I was reading. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Isabella replied, "and I've never encountered a situation quite like this. Usually when family members try to take over wedding planning, there's at least some pretense of collaboration with the couple. Mrs. Pierce was operating as if you and Cameron were children who needed adult supervision rather than engaged adults planning their own celebration." Armed with this documentation, I began expanding my investigation to other vendors we had contacted about wedding services. What I discovered was a pattern of interference that was both systematic and sophisticated, revealing a level of psychological manipulation that I was only beginning to understand. At Rosewood Florists, where Cameron and I had scheduled a consultation for the following week, I learned that Evelyn had already met with the owner, Diane Ashford, to discuss family flower preferences and establish appropriate parameters for floral design. Diane showed me notes from their meeting that specified traditional arrangements in ivory and gold rather than the seasonal garden style Cameron and I had discussed. Mrs. Pierce was very specific about the importance of classic elegance, Diane explained. She mentioned the bride was young and might not understand the difference between trendy choices and timeless sophistication that would photograph well and reflect the family's social position. At Harmony Strings, the musical group we had considered for ceremony music, I discovered that Evelyn had not only contacted them directly, but had also provided them with a detailed playlist of classical selections that she deemed appropriate for a Pierce family wedding. The musician I spoke with, Alexander Chen, seemed confused when I mentioned that Cameron and I had different musical preferences. Mrs. Pierce was very clear that she was handling all musical arrangements for the wedding, Alexander said. She mentioned that the couple was busy with other planning aspects and had delegated musical decisions to her. She even put down a deposit to secure our services for your wedding date. The revelation that Evelyn had been making deposits with vendors on our behalf without our knowledge or consent was the moment I realized this situation had escalated far beyond inappropriate family involvement. She was actively contracting services for our wedding and creating financial obligations that would make it difficult for us to change vendors even if we wanted to. My investigation expanded to include the photographer Evelyn had mentioned during our engagement party, Adrienne Blackwell, the supposedly sought-after event photographer whose services Evelyn had secured for our celebration. When I called Adrienne's studio to inquire about her availability for our wedding date, I was shocked to learn that not only had Evelyn already booked her services, but she had also provided specific instructions about the style and content of photography we wanted. Miss Pierce was very clear about the importance of formal portrait photography that would document the significance of the family event, Adrienne told me during our phone conversation. She specifically requested traditional posed shots that would be suitable for family archives, rather than the candid photojournalistic style that some younger couples prefer. Adrienne had already scheduled engagement photo sessions, planned shot lists for the wedding day, and received detailed instructions about which family members should be prioritized in formal group photographs. Evelyn had essentially planned our entire wedding photography experience, according to her preferences, while ensuring that the style would be completely different from what Cameron and I had discussed wanting. The catering investigation revealed perhaps the most egregious example of Evelyn's attempted control over our celebration. At Sterling Catering, the company we had planned to contact about reception dining options, I learned that Evelyn had not only already met with the owners, but had also selected a complete menu and signed a preliminary contract for our wedding date. Mrs. Pierce mentioned that she was handling all food and beverage planning for the wedding, explained Patricia Sterling, the catering company's owner. She seemed very knowledgeable about event planning and had specific requirements about the style of service that would be appropriate for a family celebration of this importance. The menu Evelyn had selected was formal, expensive, and completely different from the casual garden party style that Cameron and I had envisioned. She had chosen a 6-course seated dinner with wine pairings that would cost nearly double what we had budgeted for catering, and had specified that all service should be white glove formal rather than the relaxed elegance we prefer. But the most shocking discovery came when Patricia mentioned the guest count Evelyn had provided for catering planning purposes: 450 people. Cameron and I had been discussing a wedding of approximately 150 guests, close family, dear friends, and important people in our lives who we actually wanted to celebrate with. Evelyn had apparently been planning a massive social event that would include her entire social circle, Cameron's extended family from across the region, colleagues from her professional network, and various community figures she felt should be included in what she called such an important Pierce family celebration. She mentioned that the bride and groom were young and might not understand the social obligations that come with a family wedding, Patricia explained. Ms. Pierce seemed very concerned about ensuring that all appropriate people were included, and that the celebration reflected the family's standing in the community. As I compiled documentation from vendor after vendor, a clear picture emerged of systematic manipulation that went far beyond enthusiastic family involvement. Evelyn had been conducting a parallel wedding planning process designed to override every decision Cameron and I made while creating financial and social obligations that would make it difficult for us to assert our own preferences. She had been positioning herself as the primary decision-maker for our wedding, while presenting her control as protective assistance to vendors who didn't know any better. Each vendor had been told that the bride was overwhelmed, inexperienced, or unable to handle the complexity of planning an appropriate celebration for a family of the Pierces' social standing. The investigation had taken me 3 days of phone calls, meetings, and document collection, but by Friday evening, I had assembled a comprehensive file that documented the scope of Evelyn's attempted takeover of our wedding plan. The evidence was undeniable, systematic, and far more extensive than I had initially suspected. But as I sat in my apartment reviewing the documentation I had gathered, I realized that proving Evelyn's manipulation was only the first step. The real challenge would be convincing Cameron that his mother's behavior was deliberate sabotage rather than enthusiastic assistance, and then figuring out how to reclaim control of our own wedding planning without destroying his relationship with his family. This was no longer just about wedding planning differences. This was about establishing boundaries that would protect our marriage from ongoing manipulation for years to come. The evidence folder I had compiled was sitting on my kitchen table like a loaded weapon, and I knew that how I handled the next few days would determine not just the fate of our wedding planning, but the entire future of my relationship with Cameron and his family. I needed professional guidance from someone who understood both family psychology and event planning logistics. Someone who could help me develop a strategy that would protect our wedding while preserving as much family harmony as possible. My first call was to Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a family therapist who specialized in boundary setting and relationship dynamics. I had found her through my employee assistance program at Stellar Communications, and her initial phone consultation revealed that my situation was more common than I had realized.
though perhaps more extreme than most cases she encountered.
What you're describing is a classic pattern of enmeshment and control, Dr. Martinez explained during our hour-long session. Your future mother-in-law is operating from a psychological framework where she believes she has the right and responsibility to make major decisions for her adult son, and she's extending that control to include you as his partner. Martinez helped me understand that Evelyn's behavior wasn't just about wedding planning, it was about establishing dominance in our relationship and ensuring that her position as the primary woman in Cameron's life remained unchallenged. The wedding was simply the most visible battleground for a power struggle that would continue throughout our marriage unless clear boundaries were established immediately. The challenge you're facing, Martinez continued, is that your fiancé has been conditioned since childhood to view his mother's involvement as normal and beneficial. Confronting this dynamic will require tremendous courage and strategic thinking, because you'll be asking him to recognize patterns of manipulation that feel like love and support to him. The therapy session provided me with valuable psychological insights, but I also needed practical guidance about wedding planning logistics and vendor management. My next consultation was with Samantha Cross, an independent wedding planner who specialized in what she diplomatically called complex family situations, weddings where family dynamics threaten to overwhelm the couple's actual preferences. I've seen this exact scenario at least a dozen times, Samantha told me when I showed her the vendor documentation I had collected. A controlling family member attempts to hijack the wedding planning process by establishing themselves as the decision-maker with vendors before the couple realizes what's happening. Samantha's experience with similar situations was invaluable for developing a practical strategy to reclaim control of our wedding planning. She outlined a step-by-step process that would allow Cameron and me to assert our preferences, while minimizing the potential for family conflict and vendor confusion. The first step is vendor communication management, Samantha explained. You need to contact every single vendor your future mother-in-law has spoken with and establish clear boundaries about who has authority to make decisions and changes to your wedding plan. Samantha helped me draft professional emails that would accomplish this goal without unnecessarily antagonizing Evelyn or creating awkward situations for vendors who had been caught in the middle of our family dynamic. The template she provided was firm but diplomatic, establishing our authority while avoiding inflammatory language that might escalate the conflict. The second step is financial clarity, Samantha continued. You need to understand exactly what financial commitments your future mother-in-law has made on your behalf, and decide whether you want to accept her contributions or maintain complete financial independence for your wedding plan. This financial analysis revealed another layer of Ellen's manipulation strategy. By making deposits and signing preliminary contracts with vendors, she had created financial obligations that would be expensive and complicated to change. Canceling her arrangements would result in lost deposits and potentially higher costs with alternative vendors, creating economic pressure to accept her planning decisions. This is actually a form of financial manipulation, Samantha explained. She's using money as a tool to control your choices, by making it expensive to disagree with her preferences. The third component of our strategy focused on Cameron's involvement and education about appropriate family boundaries and wedding plans. Samantha recommended that we schedule a joint consultation where she could help him understand why his mother's level of involvement was problematic from a professional perspective. Sometimes men who have been raised by controlling mothers need to hear boundary information from a neutral third party, Samantha said. They've been conditioned to view excessive involvement as caring rather than controlling, so professional validation can be helpful for recognizing when lines have been crossed. Armed with professional guidance from both Martinez and Samantha Cross, I began developing a comprehensive strategy that would address the psychological, practical, and financial aspects of Evelyn's attempted takeover of our wedding plan. The approach needed to be systematic and well documented to be effective against someone as sophisticated as Evelyn. The first phase of my strategy involved securing our vendor relationships and establishing clear communication protocols that would prevent future. I scheduled individual meetings with Isabella at Grandview Manor, Diane at Rosewood Florists, Alexander at Harmony Strings, Adrian Blackwell Photography, and Patricia at Sterling Catering. Each meeting followed the same basic script that Samantha had helped me develop: acknowledgement of the confusion that had been created,
clarification of decision-making authority, and establishment of communication protocols that would prevent future unauthorized contact from family members. I want to apologize for any confusion that may have occurred regarding planning authority for our wedding. I began each conversation. There seems to have been a misunderstanding about who has decision-making responsibility for our celebration. Going forward, all planning communications should go directly through my fiancé Cameron Mitchell and myself. Most vendors were relieved to have clarity about the situation, and readily agreed to adjust their communication protocol. Several mentioned that they had found Evelyn's approach unusual and had been uncomfortable with the level of control she was attempting to exercise over planning decisions. Isabella at Grandview Manor was particularly supportive of our efforts to establish appropriate boundaries. "I've been hoping you would address this situation," she admitted. "Mrs. Pierce's level of involvement was concerning from a professional perspective, and I'm glad you're taking control of your own wedding plan. The financial component of my strategy required more delicate handling, since Evelyn had made deposits and created contractual obligations that would affect our wedding budget if we chose to make changes. After reviewing all the documentation I had collected, Samantha helped me calculate the true cost of accepting versus rejecting Evelyn's vendor selection. You're looking at approximately $8,000 in lost deposits and cancellation fees if you change all the vendors she's contracted with," Samantha explained. "But you're also looking at a wedding that costs nearly double your original budget and reflects none of your actual preferences if you accept her arrangement." The financial analysis revealed that Evelyn's vendor selections would result in a total wedding cost of approximately $75,000, 3 times what Cameron and I had budgeted for our celebration. Her generous contributions were actually creating financial obligations that would put us in debt for years after our wedding. "This is another form of control," Samantha pointed out. "She's creating a financial situation where you'll either accept her planning decisions or go into debt asserting your own preferences. Either way, she maintains influence over your wedding experience." The psychological preparation for confronting Cameron about his mother's behavior was the most challenging aspect of my strategic planning. Martinez had warned me that people who had been raised by controlling parents often experienced cognitive dissonance when forced to recognize manipulation patterns, and that Cameron might initially respond with defensiveness rather than understanding. "You'll need to present your evidence systematically and avoid making this about his character or his relationship with his mother," Dr. Martinez advised. "Focus on specific behaviors and their impact on your wedding planning, rather than attempting to analyze his mother's motivations or psychology." Martinez helped me develop a communication approach that would maximize the probability of Cameron recognizing the problematic nature of his mother's involvement without feeling like he was being forced to choose between his family and his fiancé. "Use the documentation you've collected to let the facts speak for themselves," she suggested. "Present the vendor communications, the contract modifications, and the financial obligations that were created without your knowledge or consent. Let him draw his own conclusions about whether this level of involvement is appropriate." The strategic planning process took nearly 2 weeks, but by the end of that time I had developed a comprehensive approach that addressed every aspect of Evelyn's attempted manipulation while providing multiple options for resolution that would accommodate different levels of family cooperation. I had professional support from both a therapist and a wedding planner who understood the complexity of my situation. I had documented evidence of systematic vendor manipulation and unauthorized financial commitment. I had established clear communication protocols with all wedding vendors that would prevent future interference, and I had developed a presentation strategy that would help Cameron understand the scope of his mother's inappropriate involvement without forcing him into an impossible emotional position. Most importantly, I had transformed myself from a confused and overwhelmed bride-to-be into a strategic actor who understood exactly what she was facing and had a clear plan for protecting her interests. The investigation and planning process had revealed capabilities I didn't know I possessed: analytical skills, negotiation abilities, and psychological insight that would serve me well not just in resolving our current crisis, but in managing family dynamics throughout our marriage. The time had come to present my findings to Cameron and discover whether our relationship was strong enough to survive the establishment of appropriate boundaries with his mother. Everything I had learned about psychology, strategy, and professional event planning was about to be put to the ultimate test. The folder of evidence was ready, the professional support system was in place, The strategic plan was comprehensive and well documented. All that remained was finding the courage to execute a confrontation that would determine the future of our relationship and our wedding planning process.
The confrontation was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at Cameron's apartment, a setting I chose deliberately because it was neutral territory where both of us would feel comfortable, but also private enough for what I knew would be an emotionally intense conversation. I had spent the previous evening organizing my evidence folder into a logical presentation sequence, practicing my key talking points, and mentally preparing for every possible reaction Cameron might have to learning the truth about his mother's behavior. The documentation was arranged in 3 distinct sections: vendor interference, financial manipulation, and unauthorized decision-making. Each section contained emails, contracts, phone call notes, and vendor statements that painted an undeniable picture of systematic boundary violations. I had also prepared a summary sheet that outlined the total financial impact of Evelyn's actions and the specific steps we would need to take to regain control of our wedding planning. Saturday night was sleepless. I kept rehearsing different ways to present the information, trying to find approaches that would help Cameron understand the severity of the situation without making him feel like I was attacking his mother's character or demanding that he choose between his family and me. Dr. Martinez had emphasized that the key to successful confrontation was focusing on specific behaviors and their consequences, rather than attempting to analyze motivations or assign blame. I arrived at Cameron's apartment at 2 o'clock, carrying the evidence folder and a backup copy of all documentation that I had stored in my car in case the conversation went badly and I needed to leave quickly. Cameron was in an excellent mood, having spent the morning playing basketball with his college friends, and his cheerful demeanor made what I was about to reveal feel even more devastating. "Hey beautiful," he said, kissing me hello and taking the folder from my hands without really looking at it. "What's all this? Are you bringing work home again? I thought we agreed that Sundays were for relaxing and wedding planning." "Actually, this is about wedding planning," I said, settling onto his couch and trying to keep my voice steady despite my racing heart. "There are some things we need to discuss about your mother's involvement in our celebration planning." Cameron's expression shifted from casual interest to mild concern as he sat down beside me. "Is everything okay? Did something happen with one of the vendors?" "I thought everything was going smoothly after we met with Isabella last week." "That's exactly what we need to talk about," I replied, opening the folder to the first section of documentation. "Cameron, I need you to look at some information I've gathered about communications between your mother and our wedding vendors. I think you'll be surprised by what's been happening behind the scenes." I began with Isabella's documentation from Grandview Manor, showing Cameron the emails and phone call notes that revealed Evelyn's attempts to establish herself as the primary decision-maker for our wedding planning. I watched his face as he read through the communications, seeing his expression change from confusion to discomfort to genuine alarm as the scope of his mother's interference became clear. "I don't understand," Cameron said after reading through the Grandview Manor documentation. "Mom never mentioned contacting Isabella directly. She said she was just doing research to help us make good decisions, not that she was actually giving instructions to our vendors." "There's more," I said gently, moving to the next section of evidence. "This is from Rosewood Florists, Harmony Strings, Adrienne Blackwell Photography, and Sterling Catering. Your mother has contacted every single vendor we've discussed, and in several cases, she's made deposits and signed preliminary contracts for services we never approved." The vendor documentation was overwhelming in its comprehensiveness. Cameron read through email after email where Evelyn had positioned herself as the decision-maker for our wedding, overriding our preferences and creating financial obligations without our knowledge or consent. With each new piece of evidence, I could see him struggling to reconcile the behavior documented in the papers with his understanding of his mother's supportive intention. "This can't be right," Cameron said, his voice shaking slightly as he reviewed the Sterling Catering contract that committed us to a $75,000 reception for 450 guests. "Mom wouldn't sign contracts for our wedding without discussing it with us first. There has to be some kind of misunderstanding." "I thought the same thing," I replied, pulling out the financial analysis that Samantha Cross had helped me prepare. but I've verified all of this information directly with the vendor. Your mother has created financial commitments totaling nearly $30,000 in deposits and preliminary contracts, all for services that reflect her preferences rather than ours. The financial documentation was the most damaging evidence because it demonstrated that Evelyn's interference had moved beyond inappropriate advice into actual contractual obligations that would be expensive and complicated to change. Cameron stared at the summary sheet that outlined the true cost of accepting versus rejecting his mother's arrangements, and I could see him beginning to understand that this wasn't just about wedding planning differences. This was about control and manipulation. But why would she do that? Cameron asked, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose fundamental understanding of a relationship was being challenged. She knows how important this wedding is to us. She knows we want to make our own decisions about our celebration. This was the crucial moment where I needed to help Cameron understand the psychology behind his mother's behavior without making him feel like I was attacking her character or demanding that he condemn her action. Martinez had warned me that people who had been raised by controlling parents often experienced grief when forced to recognize manipulation patterns, because it meant acknowledging that what they had interpreted as love and support was actually something more complex and potentially harmful. I think your mother genuinely believes she's helping us, I said carefully. But her idea of help involves making decisions for us rather than supporting the decisions we make for ourselves. And that's not actually helpful, it's controlling. I showed Cameron the communications where Evelyn had described me as overwhelmed and inexperienced to vendors, positioning herself as the responsible adult who needed to ensure that appropriate decisions were made for our wedding. The pattern was consistent across every vendor interaction. Evelyn presented herself as the competent authority figure while characterizing Cameron and me as young people who needed guidance and supervision. She told Adrian Blackwell that we were too young to understand the difference between trendy photography and classic portraits that would be suitable for family archives, I said, showing Cameron the photographer's notes from their consultation. She told Patricia Sterling that we didn't understand the social obligations that come with a Pierce family wedding. Cameron was quiet for a long time, studying the documentation and clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. I could see him trying to find ways to interpret his mother's behavior as protective rather than controlling, but the evidence was too comprehensive and systematic to explain away as misunderstandings or miscommunications. "What do you want me to do about this?" Cameron finally asked, his voice carrying both sadness and frustration. "She's my mother, Natasha. I can't just cut her out of our wedding planning completely." "I'm not asking you to cut her out," I replied. "I'm asking you to help me establish appropriate boundaries about what level of involvement is healthy and respectful. Your mother can be involved in our wedding planning without being in control of our wedding plan." I presented Cameron with the three-option framework that Samantha Cross had helped me develop: complete financial independence with vendor selection based solely on our preferences, limited family contribution with clear decision-making boundaries, or collaborative planning with defined roles and approval processes that respected our ultimate authority as the couple getting married. "We can include your mother in the planning process," I explained, "but she needs to understand that we're the decision-makers and she's a contributor, not the other way around. And we need to establish clear communication protocols so that vendors understand who has authority to make changes to our arrangements." Cameron spent another hour reviewing the documentation and asking questions about specific vendor interactions and financial commitment. I could see him gradually accepting that his mother's behavior had crossed important boundaries, but I could also see him struggling with what that meant for their relationship and for our family dynamics going forward. "I need to talk to her about this," Cameron said finally. "Some of these things are definitely not okay, and she needs to understand that we're capable of planning our own wedding without this level of supervision." The conversation had gone better than I had dared to hope. Cameron had accepted the evidence without becoming defensive, recognized that boundaries needed to be established, and committed to addressing the situation with his mother directly. But as I gathered up the documentation and prepared to leave his apartment, I knew that the real test would come when he actually confronted Evelyn about her behavior. The next phase of our strategy would determine whether Cameron was strong enough to maintain appropriate boundaries with his mother, and whether Evelyn was willing to accept a reduced level of control over our wedding planning. Everything we had worked toward was about to be put to the ultimate test. The conversation between Cameron and his mother was scheduled for Wednesday evening at Evelyn's house in the prestigious Willowbrook Hills neighborhood, and I spent the 3 days leading up to it in a state of anxious anticipation, knowing that everything we had worked toward would be determined by whether Cameron could maintain his resolve when faced with his mother's inevitable defensive tactic. Cameron had asked me not to attend the initial conversation, explaining that he wanted to address the boundary violations privately before we all met together to discuss how to move forward with wedding plans. I understood his reasoning, but I also knew that Evelyn would be far more likely to use emotional manipulation and guilt tactics when she had Cameron alone and vulnerable to her psychological condition. "I need to handle this myself," Cameron had said when I offered to accompany him to the confrontation. "She needs to hear from me directly that her level of involvement isn't appropriate, and I think she'll be more receptive to that message if it's coming from me rather than from both of us together." On Wednesday evening, I waited at my apartment with my phone nearby, trying to distract myself with work projects while simultaneously checking the time every few minutes and imagining how the conversation might be unfolding. I had prepared Cameron as thoroughly as possible, providing him with talking points about specific vendor interference and clear examples of inappropriate boundary crossing. But I also knew that years of psychological conditioning wouldn't be easily overcome in a single conversation. The call came at 9:30, nearly 3 hours after Cameron had arrived at his mother's house, and I could tell immediately from his voice that the confrontation had not gone according to plan. "Natasha," Cameron said, his voice strained and exhausted, "I need to come over. We need to talk about what happened tonight." 20 minutes later, Cameron was sitting on my couch looking like he had been through an emotional war zone, and his report of the evening's events confirmed my worst fears about Evelyn's response to being confronted about her manipulation tactic. "She denied everything," Cameron began, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "Not just some of the vendor communications, but literally everything. She said the vendors must have misunderstood her intentions, that she was only gathering information to help us make better decisions, and that she never made any commitments on our behalf." Cameron described a 3-hour ordeal during which Evelyn had systematically attempted to reframe every piece of evidence we had gathered, presenting alternative explanations that portrayed her as a misunderstood victim of vendor miscommunication, rather than someone who had deliberately attempted to control our wedding plan. When I showed her the email she sent to Isabella about establishing family expectations and budget parameters, she said that Isabella must have misinterpreted her inquiry about venue policies. Cameron continued. "When I mentioned the deposits she made with vendors, she claimed those were research payments to hold our place in line while we made final decisions." Evelyn's defense strategy was sophisticated and psychologically manipulative, designed to make Cameron doubt the evidence he had seen with his own eyes, rather than accept that his mother had been deliberately undermining our wedding planning autonomy. She had turned his confrontation into an opportunity to position herself as the victim of unfair accusations and vendor misunderstanding. "But the worst part," Cameron said, his voice breaking slightly, "was when she started crying and telling me how hurt she was that I would believe vendors and outside parties over my own mother who had sacrificed everything to raise me and support my dream." The emotional manipulation Cameron described was exactly what Dr. Martinez had warned me to expect. Evelyn had used tears, guilt, and references to her sacrifices as a single mother to deflect attention away from her inappropriate behavior and make Cameron feel guilty for confronting her about boundary violation. She said that she had been trying to help us avoid the mistakes that young couples often make when they don't have experience with formal events. Cameron continued. "She said that all of her vendor communications were intended to gather information and options so that we could make better informed decisions, not to override our preference." But even as Cameron recounted his mother's explanations, I could see that he wasn't entirely convinced by her reframing of the evidence. The documentation we had gathered was too comprehensive and systematic to be explained away as miscommunications and misunderstanding, and Cameron's discomfort with some of Evelyn's responses suggested that he was beginning to recognize manipulation tactics that had previously been invisible to him. "There's something else," Cameron said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "When I told her that we needed to establish clearer boundaries about vendor communications and decision-making authority, she said something that really bothered me."
Cameron paused, clearly struggling with whatever he was about to reveal, and I waited patiently for him to find the words to describe what had obviously been a disturbing moment in their conversation. She said that she hoped marriage wouldn't change me too much, and that she trusted I would always remember who had been there for me during the most difficult times in my life, Cameron finally continued. It felt like she was threatening our relationship like she was suggesting that choosing you over her input would be a betrayal of everything we'd been through together. The threat Cameron described was subtle but unmistakable. Evelyn was using their emotional history and her role in his upbringing as leverage to maintain control over his adult decision-making. She was essentially telling him that asserting independence from her guidance would constitute ingratitude for her sacrifices and abandonment of their special relationship. Cameron, I said gently, that's exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that Dr. Martinez warned us about. Your mother is using guilt and obligation to discourage you from establishing appropriate boundaries, and she's framing normal adult independence as betrayal of family loyalty. Cameron was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what his mother had said and beginning to recognize the psychological tactics that had shaped their relationship throughout his adult life. I could see him struggling between his ingrained deference to her authority and his growing awareness that her behavior was inappropriate and controlling. I think I need to call her tomorrow and try again, Cameron said finally. Maybe if I approach it differently, focus more on specific vendor communications, rather than trying to address the broader pattern of control. But I knew that giving Evelyn another opportunity to manipulate the conversation would only result in more sophisticated gaslighting and emotional blackmail. She had already demonstrated that she was unwilling to acknowledge her inappropriate behavior, and additional private conversations would only provide her with more opportunities to undermine Cameron's resolve. Cameron, I said carefully, I think it's time for the three of us to meet together with a neutral mediator who can help us establish clear boundaries and communication protocol. Your mother has already shown that she's not willing to acknowledge the vendor interference when confronted privately, so we need a more structured approach. I suggested that we schedule a meeting with Samantha Cross, our wedding planner consultant, who could provide professional context for appropriate family involvement in wedding planning, while helping us establish vendor communication protocols that would prevent future interference. Samantha has experience with complex family dynamics, I explained, and she can help your mother understand why her level of vendor involvement has been problematic from a professional perspective. Sometimes people are more receptive to boundary information when it comes from a neutral third party. Cameron agreed to the mediated meeting approach, but I could see that he was still hoping to find a solution that would satisfy his mother's need for involvement while protecting our autonomy as a couple. He didn't yet fully understand that Evelyn's goal wasn't collaborative planning, it was control, and that compromise would only result in continued manipulation with different tactics. The three-way meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at Samantha Cross's office, and I spent the remainder of the week preparing for what I knew would be the ultimate test of whether our relationship could survive the establishment of appropriate boundaries with Evelyn. Everything we had discovered, analyzed, and strategized was about to be put to the final test. But as I prepared for that crucial meeting, I also began developing a backup plan for the wedding day itself, a contingency strategy that would ensure Evelyn couldn't sabotage our actual celebration even if she succeeded in maintaining control over the planning process. Because I was beginning to realize that someone as sophisticated and determined as Evelyn Pierce would never truly accept a reduced role in her son's life, and that our wedding day might require more direct action to protect our celebration from her interference. The stage was set for the final confrontation, but I was also preparing for the possibility that confrontation alone might not be enough to stop someone who viewed our marriage as a threat to her position as the primary woman in Cameron's life. The mediated meeting with Samantha Cross was a disaster from the moment Evelyn walked into the office 15 minutes late, carrying a leather portfolio that immediately signaled she had come prepared for battle rather than collaborative problem solving. Her entrance was perfectly orchestrated, apologetic enough to seem reasonable, but confident enough to establish that she viewed this meeting as an inconvenience, rather than a necessary intervention. "I'm so sorry to keep everyone waiting," Evelyn said as she settled into the chair across from Cameron and me, her smile warm but her eyes calculating. I had to finish a call with Adrian Blackwell about some exciting additions to the photography package that I thought you might want to consider. The immediate reference to vendor communications was deliberate provocation, designed to demonstrate that our previous confrontations had not deterred her from continuing to make wedding-related decisions without our involvement. Samantha Cross caught the implication immediately, her professional expression tightening slightly as she realized that Evelyn was openly defying the boundaries we had attempted to establish. "Miss Tierce," Samantha began diplomatically, "I understand there's been some confusion about communication protocols with wedding vendors. The purpose of today's meeting is to clarify roles and establish clear guidelines that will help everyone work together effectively." Evelyn's response revealed the sophisticated psychological warfare she was prepared to wage to maintain control over our wedding plan. Rather than acknowledging that her vendor communications had been inappropriate, she positioned herself as a concerned family member who was being unfairly criticized for trying to help young people navigate complex social obligations. "Cross," Evelyn replied, her tone carrying just enough condescension to be insulting while remaining technically polite, "but I think there may be some misunderstanding about my role in this process. As the mother of the groom and a significant financial contributor to this celebration, I naturally have input about decisions that will reflect on our family's reputation in the community." The phrase "significant financial contributor" was loaded with threat and manipulation. Evelyn was reminding everyone present that she held financial leverage over our wedding planning, and that opposing her preferences might result in the withdrawal of funding that would make our celebration impossible within our current budget. Samantha attempted to explain professional boundaries around family involvement in wedding planning, but Evelyn had clearly prepared counter-arguments that revealed extensive research into wedding etiquette and vendor management practice. She cited examples from wedding planning magazines, referenced social customs from her generation, and quoted advice from other event planners that supported her position, that concerned family members should be involved in major decision-making processes. "I've been organizing social events for over 30 years, Evelyn said, opening her leather portfolio to reveal printed articles and professional recommendations that supported her approach. "I understand that younger generations prefer different approaches to family involvement, but there are certain standards and expectations that come with celebrations of this magnitude." Cameron attempted to support my position by explaining that we appreciated her input, but needed to maintain final authority over our own wedding decision. But Evelyn's response revealed that she had anticipated his newfound backbone and prepared sophisticated countermeasures designed to undermine his resolve without appearing overtly manipulative. "Of course you're the decision-maker's darling," Evelyn said to Cameron, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child. "But decision-making requires having complete information about options, costs and social implications that you might not have considered. That's why I've been researching vendors and gathering information, to make sure you have everything you need to make good choices." The reframing was masterful. Evelyn wasn't trying to control our decisions, she was ensuring that we had adequate information to make appropriate choices. Her vendor communications weren't interference, they were her deposits and preliminary contracts weren't unauthorized commitments, they were placeholder arrangements that protected our options while we deliberate.
When I presented specific documentation of her unauthorized vendor commitments, Evelyn had prepared explanations for every single piece of evidence. The Sterling catering contract wasn't a binding agreement, it was a preliminary arrangement that could be modified. The Adrian Blackwell photography deposit wasn't a unilateral decision, it was securing services for a popular photographer before her schedule filled up. I realized that my proactive approach might seem overwhelming to someone who isn't familiar with event planning logistics, Evelyn said, directing her comment to me with surgical precision. "But these vendors require advance commitments to hold premium dates, and I wanted to make sure Cameron had access to the best possible services for his special day." The emphasis on Cameron's special day rather than our special day was another calculated psychological strike, designed to reinforce that she viewed the wedding as primarily about her son, rather than about our partnership. She was positioning herself as Cameron's primary advocate, while suggesting that my concerns about vendor interference were evidence of selfishness or inexperience. Samantha Cross attempted to establish neutral ground by focusing on practical vendor communication protocols, but Evelyn had anticipated this approach as well. She agreed enthusiastically to any guidelines that sounded reasonable, while simultaneously creating loopholes that would allow her to continue her interference under the guise of helpful family involvement. "I'm absolutely committed to respecting whatever communication boundaries you feel are necessary," Evelyn said with apparent sincerity. "Of course, if vendors contact me directly with questions or concerns, I'll naturally want to be helpful rather than referring them elsewhere when I have information that might be useful." The meeting lasted 2 hours and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that Evelyn was far more sophisticated in her manipulation tactics than any of us had anticipated. She had transformed every attempt to establish boundaries into evidence of our inexperience and ungrateful attitudes toward family assistance. She had reframed every piece of evidence about inappropriate behavior as misunderstanding or helpful initiative. Most disturbing, she had successfully positioned herself as the reasonable adult in the room while making Cameron and me appear petty, controlling, and unappreciative of generous family support. By the end of the meeting, even Samantha Cross seemed uncertain about whether Evelyn's level of involvement was inappropriate or simply more hands-on than modern couples typically prefer. The drive home from Samantha's office was tense and quiet, with Cameron clearly struggling to process what had happened, and me realizing that traditional boundary-setting approaches would be completely ineffective against someone as psychologically sophisticated as Evelyn Pierce. "I don't understand," Cameron said finally. "Everything she said sounded reasonable when she was explaining it. Maybe we're being too sensitive about her involvement. She really does have experience with these kinds of events, and she is contributing financially to the wedding." The meeting had achieved exactly what Evelyn intended. It had undermined Cameron's confidence in our position while making him doubt whether his mother's behavior was actually problematic. Her explanations had been crafted to sound logical and benevolent, making our objections appear unreasonable and ungrateful. That evening, I received a phone call that confirmed my worst fears about Evelyn's escalation strategy. Isabella Hawthorne from Grandview Manor called to inform me that Evelyn had contacted her again, this time claiming that the mediated meeting had resolved all communication issues, and that she was now authorized to coordinate vendor logistics on our behalf. "Mrs. Pierce mentioned that you've asked her to handle vendor coordination to reduce stress during your engagement period," Isabella said. "She's requested access to all vendor contact information and wants to schedule a comprehensive planning meeting to ensure everything is perfectly coordinated for your wedding day." The audacity was breathtaking. Evelyn had not only ignored everything discussed during our mediated meeting, but she had actually used the meeting as cover story for expanding her control over our wedding planning. She was telling vendors that we had officially authorized her involvement, turning our attempt to establish boundaries into justification for increased interference. "Isabella," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my rage, "we absolutely did not authorize Ms. Pierce to coordinate vendor communications on our behalf. Please do not provide her with vendor contact information or schedule any meetings without speaking directly to Cameron and me first." But the damage was already spread. Over the next 3 days, I received similar calls from Diane at Rosewood Florists, Alexander at Harmony Strings, and Patricia at Sterling Cater. Evelyn had contacted each of them with variations of the same story. We had recognized her expertise and asked her to handle coordination details to reduce our stress levels. She was systematically undermining the boundaries we had attempted to establish while positioning her continued interference as authorized assistance that we had specifically requested. Any vendor who called to verify her authority was told that we were overwhelmed with work commitments and preferred to handle wedding planning through family channels. The psychological pressure on Cameron was enormous. His mother had successfully made him doubt his own perceptions about appropriate boundaries while positioning herself as the victim of unfair criticism from an ungrateful future daughter-in-law. She had turned our legitimate concerns about control and manipulation into evidence of our immaturity and inability to appreciate generous family support. "Maybe we should just let her handle the vendor coordination," Cameron suggested during one of our increasingly strained conversations about the ongoing situation. "She does have experience with these things, and it would take some pressure off us during the final planning stage." I realized that traditional approaches to resolving family boundary issues would never work with someone as sophisticated as Evelyn Pierce. She had anticipated every reasonable strategy we might employ and prepared countermeasures that turned our attempts at boundary setting into opportunities for increased control. That's when I began developing the contingency plan that would eventually lead to the sprinkler system activation at our wedding. If Evelyn was determined to sabotage our wedding planning through manipulation and control, I was going to ensure that our actual wedding day remained under our authority, regardless of whatever scheme she was planning for that final, irreversible moment when all her months of manipulation would culminate in her ultimate power play. Because by that point, I had no doubt that she was planning something dramatic for our wedding day itself. Something that would establish her dominance over our marriage from the very beginning and demonstrate to everyone present that her position as the primary woman in Cameron's life would never be successfully challenged. The white dress she had selected for our wedding was just the beginning of whatever final assault she was planning on our celebration, and I was going to be ready for her. The final 2 weeks before our wedding became a carefully orchestrated performance where I smiled through bridal shower, nodded agreeably during final vendor meetings, and allowed Evelyn to believe that her psychological warfare had succeeded in breaking my resistance to her control over our celebration. But beneath the surface of bridal compliance, I was methodically preparing for the most satisfying moment of revenge in wedding history. The inspiration for my sprinkler system strategy had come during my final walkthrough with Martinez Rodriguez, Grandview Manor's head groundskeeper, who had mentioned the manual override system as a safety feature for the outdoor ceremony space. What Martinez didn't realize was that he was providing me with the perfect tool for ensuring that Evelyn's final power play would backfire spectacularly. The system can activate all garden zones simultaneously in case of emergency, Martinez had explained, pointing out the discrete control panel hidden behind the altar's permanent floral installation. Each zone has individual controls, but the master override can flood the entire ceremony area within 30 seconds if needed for fire safety or other urgent situations. I had asked innocent questions about activation procedures, zone coverage areas, and system responsiveness, gathering technical information that would prove crucial for timing my revenge perfectly. The sprinkler system covered not just the immediate altar area but extended throughout the ceremony seating arrangement and the cocktail reception space where guests would gather immediately after the ceremony. My reconnaissance revealed that Evelyn's white dress selection was even more audacious than I had initially realized. Through careful investigation, I discovered that she had purchased a Vera Wang gown, the same designer as my wedding dress, in what she claimed was champagne, but was actually a shade of ivory so close to white that it might as well have been bridal attire. The dress had cost over $4,000 and featured intricate beadwork that would be completely ruined by water exposure. More importantly, Evelyn had scheduled a professional hair and makeup appointment for the morning of our wedding, investing significant time and money in looking absolutely perfect for what she clearly viewed as her triumphant moment of establishing dominance over our marriage. My final vendor conversations confirmed that Evelyn had been planning additional surprises for our wedding day that went far beyond wearing white. She had arranged for a special mother-son dance that wasn't part of our original reception timeline, commissioned a commemorative video tribute to Cameron's childhood that would be played during dinner, and even coordinated with Adrienne Blackwell to ensure extensive photography of her interactions with Cameron throughout the celebration. Pierce emphasized that she wanted comprehensive documentation of the family milestone moments, Adrienne had told me during our final photography consultation. She's particularly interested in capturing the mother-son relationship dynamics during the ceremony and reception. Evelyn was essentially planning a parallel celebration focused on her relationship with Cameron, using our wedding as the backdrop for her own emotional performance. The white dress was just the most visible element of a comprehensive strategy designed to position herself as the star of our wedding day. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect November weather, crisp, clear, and absolutely ideal for outdoor photography. As I went through the traditional bridal preparations in the Manor's luxurious bridal suite, surrounded by my closest friends and family who had traveled from across the country to celebrate with us, I felt a sense of calm determination that surprised even me. My mother, who had flown in from Oregon,
was bustling around with typical maternal excitement, helping with final dress adjustments and offering continuous reassurance about how beautiful everything looked. My college friends were taking pictures, sharing memories, and creating the kind of joyful chaos that should surround every bride on her wedding day. But I was also monitoring the security feed that Isabella had discreetly provided access to, watching for Evelyn's arrival and mentally rehearsing the timing that would be crucial for my plan's success. The sprinkler activation needed to occur at exactly the right moment, after the ceremony had concluded, and photography had captured our genuine wedding moments. But before Evelyn could begin her planned dominance performance during the cocktail reception, at exactly 2:30 p.m., 30 minutes before our ceremony was scheduled to begin, Evelyn's silver Mercedes pulled into Grandview Manor's circular driveway. Even from the bridal suite window, I could see that she was wearing white, not the subtle champagne she had claimed, but an unmistakably bridal shade of ivory that would photograph identically to my own dress. She stepped out of her car like a queen arriving at her own coronation, her hair and makeup professionally perfect, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed she had successfully manipulated everyone around her into accepting her inappropriate behavior. The beaded gown caught the sunlight beautifully, creating exactly the kind of dramatic visual impact she had been planning for months. Cameron's reaction to seeing his mother in her white gown was visible even from the bridal suite. I watched through the security monitor as his face shifted from happiness to confusion to obvious discomfort, but I also saw him struggle with the psychological conditioning that made directly confronting her behavior nearly impossible for him. The ceremony itself was absolutely perfect. Cameron looked devastatingly handsome in his charcoal gray tuxedo, our vows were heartfelt and genuine, and the late afternoon sunlight created magical photography conditions that captured every emotion and detail beautifully. For 30 minutes, Evelyn's inappropriate attire was overshadowed by the genuine joy and love surrounding our marriage celebration. But as soon as the ceremony concluded, and guests began transitioning to the cocktail reception area, Evelyn launched into her planned performance. She positioned herself prominently in the receiving line, ensuring that every guest interaction included her prominently in photographs. She began holding court near the bar, regaling Cameron's relatives and our family friends with stories about his childhood and their special relationship. Most audaciously, she began intercepting congratulations that were meant for Cameron and me, accepting compliments about the wedding planning and taking credit for the beautiful celebration that she claimed to have coordinated. I watched her redirect conversation after conversation away from our marriage and toward her role as the devoted mother who had made everything possible. That's when I knew the moment had arrived for justice to be served. I excused myself from a conversation with my college roommates, walked casually toward the altar area where the manual override panel was concealed behind the permanent floral arrangement, and calmly pressed the activation sequence that Martinez had described during our venue tour. The effect was immediate and absolutely spectacular. Water erupted from concealed sprinkler heads throughout the cocktail reception area, soaking every guest within a 50-foot radius of the bar where Evelyn had been holding court. Her $4,000 Vera Wang gown was instantly transformed from pristine ivory elegance into a soggy, mascara-streaked disaster that clung uncomfortably to her body. The psychological impact was even more satisfying than the visual spectacle. Evelyn's carefully constructed facade of maternal authority crumbled instantly as she stood there dripping wet, her professional hair and makeup ruined, her white dress revealing the calculated nature of her outfit choice to every guest present. The gasps of shock from our wedding guests were immediately followed by nervous laughter as people realized that while the malfunction was inconvenient, it was also undeniably hilarious. Evelyn's attempt to upstage the bride had backfired in the most public and embarrassing way possible. "Oh my goodness," I exclaimed, rushing toward the chaos with perfectly performed concern. "What a terrible malfunction. Is everyone okay? Should we call the groundskeeper to fix the system?" Cameron was simultaneously shocked, confused, and secretly relieved that his mother's inappropriate wedding day behavior had been so dramatically interrupted. I could see him struggling between concern for her comfort and recognition that her white dress selection had been exposed for exactly what it was, a deliberate attempt to compete with his bride on their wedding day. The aftermath unfolded exactly as I had hoped. Evelyn was forced to leave the reception early to change into dry clothing, missing the dinner service, toasts, and dancing that she had planned to dominate with her presence. The story of the sprinkler malfunction that ruined the mother of the groom's white dress became the most talked about moment of our wedding celebration. More importantly, the incident served as a wake-up call for Cameron about the extent of his mother's inappropriate behavior. Seeing her white dress soaked and ruined made it impossible for him to continue denying that her outfit choice had been a deliberate attempt to upstage me on our wedding day. 6 months later, our marriage is stronger than ever, built on a foundation of clear boundaries and mutual respect that was forged through surviving Evelyn's manipulation attempt. We've established communication protocols with our vendors for future family events, implemented financial boundaries that prevent unauthorized commitments, and developed strategies for managing family dynamics that protect our partnership. Evelyn still tries occasional boundary violations, but they're met with immediate, unified resistance from both Cameron and me. The sprinkler incident taught her that her manipulation tactics have consequences, and that underestimating the bride on her wedding day was a mistake she'll never forget. And every time I see photos from our wedding day, especially the ones of Evelyn's soggy white dress, I'm reminded that sometimes the only way to stop a manipulative person is to give them exactly what they deserve: consequences that match the audacity of their behavior. The foundation of lies and control that she had so carefully constructed was indeed washed away in an instant, and in its place, we built something much stronger: a marriage based on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and the knowledge that we're capable of protecting our relationship from anyone who tries to undermine it. After all, some people need to learn the hard way that trying to steal someone's thunder on their wedding day might just leave you all washed up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.